It is 4:14 a.m. on March 27, 2026. High above the churning frigid waters of the Aleutian Trench, a satellite array maintained by the United States Geological Survey registers a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the gravity field 30 miles off the coast of the Shumagin Islands, Alaska. This is not a glitch. What scientists saw in the last week's data changes everything we thought we knew about the stability of the North Pacific seafloor. This is not a slow geological crawl. It is happening in real time. Hidden beneath 6 kilometers of ocean and crust lies a reservoir of magma so massive it challenges the very definition of a supervolcano. For decades, the Shumagin Gap was a tectonic mystery, a silent stretch of the subduction zone that refused to snap. But the silence wasn't peace, it was a lead. New data published today in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment reveals that the magma reservoir that fueled the largest volcanic eruption of the last 10,000 years in the Western Hemisphere has just been mapped in detail for the first time. It sits less than 6 kilometers below the seafloor, and the conclusion reached by the joint team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the USGS completely upends our understanding of volcanic recharge. The reservoir is filling again, and the magma arriving now is entirely new, pristine, volatile, and rising directly from the Earth's mantle. This is the Shumagin-Submerged Caldera, a titan that most Americans have never heard of, despite it producing the largest volcanic event of the Holocene. 7,300 years ago, this monster released a volume of pyroclastic material so enormous that the crust above the reservoir collapsed inward, forming a crater 19 miles in diameter on the Pacific floor. It was a VEI 7 event. To put that in perspective, the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, which cooled the entire planet and sent tsunamis across the globe, was a VEI 6. The Shumagin eruption was 10 times more powerful. It buried the Alaskan peninsula under meters of ash and sent tsunamis crashing into the west coast of the United States with enough force to rearrange the coastline of Oregon and California. The data confirms the nightmare. The system did not die after its catastrophic release. It rebuilt itself in the exact same location. The chamber is occupied again, and the pressure is mounting against the weight of the Pacific Ocean itself. The clock isn't just ticking. The seismic heartbeat of a continent is beginning to accelerate. At 7:22 a.m. on February 14, 2026, a network of deep-sea pressure sensors maintained by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, detected a series of anomalous pulses near the Shumagin Islands. These were not the standard tectonic signatures of a subducting plate. They were harmonic tremors, low-frequency, rhythmic vibrations that indicate the movement of massive volumes of fluid through fractured rock. At 15 kilometers depth, the crust was beginning to groan under a vertical load it hadn't carried in millennia. By early March, the United States Geological Survey's Alaska Volcano Observatory noted that GNSS stations on the uninhabited outer islands showed a 12-centimeter seaward offset. The seafloor wasn't just moving, it was inflating. The data that changed everything arrived on March 27, 2026, when a joint task force from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the USGS released the results of an unprecedented submarine seismic survey. For 3 months, the research vessel Marcus G. Lancet had been crisscrossing the Shumagin Gap, deploying arrays of high-energy air guns to send controlled seismic pulses through miles of seawater and into the mantle. Beneath the waves, a grid of 120 ocean bottom seismometers, or OBS, recorded how these waves propagated. The resulting tomographic image is the most terrifyingly detailed map of a supervolcano ever produced. It reveals a massive, low-velocity anomaly situated between 2.5 and 6 kilometers beneath the ocean floor. In the language of geophysics, low velocity is a code word for magma. This is a region of partially molten rock, viscous and pressurized, spanning nearly 30 kilometers in width. This is not a vague inference based on distant sensors, says Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a lead geophysicist with the USGS. The seismic imaging allows us to see the geometry of the reservoir with surgical precision. We are looking at a chamber that has been actively recharging for at least the last 4,000 years. The volume of magma currently held in suspension is enough to trigger a global-scale event. The most chilling part of the data is the chemical fingerprinting. Using remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, the team collected samples from the small active vents at the center of the caldera. Lab analysis conducted at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory confirmed that this magma is not a remnant of the 7,300-year-old eruption. It is fresh, basaltic material rising directly from the mantle, chemically distinct from the silicic dacite that buried the region in the Holocene. This is a hot recharge system, the most dangerous configuration a volcano can have. The structural integrity of the North American plate in this region is now under extreme scrutiny. The reservoir sits at a critical junction where the Pacific plate is forced beneath Alaska. Usually, this subduction is a grinding, slow-motion collision. But the presence of this shallow, massive magma body acts as a thermal lubricant, weakening the rock layers above it. The weak layer isn't snow or topsoil. It is the very crust that holds back the Pacific Ocean. As the reservoir fills, the lithostatic pressure, the weight of the rock and water above, is being countered by the magmatic overpressure from below. The infrastructure implications for the United States are staggering. This caldera sits directly beneath the Great Circle shipping route, the primary maritime artery connecting the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Anchorage to the global economy. Over $200 billion in cargo passes over this exact magma chamber every year. Beneath the surface, the trans-Pacific fiber optic cables, the backbone of the American internet and financial markets, snake through the very canyons formed by the caldera's previous collapse. If the seafloor fails, the decoupling of the North American and Pacific plates would not just trigger a localized eruption. It would initiate a megathrust earthquake and a tsunami that would reach the coast of Washington and Oregon in less than 4 hours. The sensors are screaming, the ground is rising, and the data suggests we are no longer looking at a dormant relic, but a fully fueled, pressurized engine of destruction. The 7,300-year-old ghost of the Shumagin eruption is not merely a geological curiosity, it is a blueprint for the American future. To understand the scale of what is currently brewing beneath the Aleutian Trench, we have to look at the only other Holocene event that even comes close: the eruption of Mount Mazama in Oregon, roughly 7,700 years ago. That eruption created what we now know as Crater Lake, collapsing a 12,000-foot peak into a 5-mile wide caldera and ejecting 50 cubic kilometers of magma. It was a staggering display of planetary power that defined the Northwest's landscape. But the Shumagin-Submerged Caldera was twice that size. It didn't just collapse a mountain. It collapsed the sea floor itself across an area larger than the city of Seattle. The volume of material displaced was so vast that if it were spread evenly across the contiguous United States, it would bury every single state under an inch of volcanic glass and ash. For decades, the prevailing scientific consensus within the USGS and the National Science Foundation was that supersystems of this magnitude required tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years to recharge after a VI7 or VI8 event. The logic was simple. The crust was too shattered, the heat too dissipated. We believed we were living in a period of geological grace. The Shumagin study, published in March 2026, has shattered that complacency. By documenting a massive 30-kilometer wide reservoir that has functionally rebuilt itself in less than 4,000 years, scientists have proven that the reset button on a supervolcano is much more sensitive than we ever dared to imagine. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a senior geophysicist at the Alaska Volcano Observatory and one of the lead investigators on the 2026 seismic survey, emphasizes the global and specifically American implications of this discovery. What we found at Shumagin changes the math for Yellowstone, Thorne states. The magma reinjection mechanism we've documented is not an isolated Alaskan phenomenon. It is the fundamental operating system for large-scale calderas. The data shows that the Shumagin reservoir sits at a depth of 2.5 to 6 kilometers. This is an almost perfect mirror to the shallow magma chamber beneath Yellowstone National Park, which resides between 3 and 8 kilometers below the Wyoming crust. For years, monitoring at Yellowstone has detected ground inflation and swarms of thousands of earthquakes, which many scientists interpreted as the system breathing or moving hydrothermal fluids. But the Shumagin data suggests a more ominous interpretation. These signals are the diagnostic markers of active mantle recharge. The science of magma coupling is what makes this so critical. In the Pacific Northwest and the Aleutians, the magma reservoirs are coupled with the subduction of the Pacific plate. As the plate slides under Alaska, it carries water and volatiles that lower the melting point of the mantle, creating a conveyor belt of fresh, pressurized magma. The 2026 chemical analysis of the Shumagin lava dome confirms that this new magma is arriving continuously. It is not recycled material. It is a fresh injection of energy from the deep earth. This same coupling, though driven by a different mechanism known as a mantle plume or hotspot, is what fuels Yellowstone. The Shumagin study proves that the presence of a recently emptied chamber is not a safeguard. It is a pre-existing structural weakness that the Earth uses to funnel new magma toward the surface. Statistical forecast models based on this new data have forced a re-evaluation of the cyclicity of American supereruptions. We used to speak in terms of 600,000 year cycles for Yellowstone or 700,000 for the Long Valley caldera in California. But if a system as large as Shumagin can rebuild a VI7 capable reservoir in just 3,900 years, those long-term cycles are dangerously misleading. The window of inevitability has moved from the distant future into the historical present. We are looking at a system that is not just active, but synchronized. The coupling of plate tectonics, reservoir overpressure, and the structural fragility of the crust means that a failure in one part of the system, such as a major earthquake in the Shumagin Gap, could act as the detonator for the magmatic charge sitting just 6 kilometers below. The scientific community is no longer asking if these reservoirs can refill quickly. They are now desperately trying to calculate how much more pressure the American crust can sustain before it reaches the breaking point. For Jim McCord, a third-generation crab fisherman operating out of Sandpoint, Alaska, the first sign that the seafloor was changing wasn't a seismic alarm, but a haunting physical transformation of the water. On the morning of March 28, 2026, just 24 hours after the University of Alaska and USGS published their findings, McCord's vessel, the Northern Star, entered a patch of the Pacific directly above the mapped caldera. The sonar went white, McCord recounted in a recorded statement for the National Marine Fisheries Service. I thought the equipment had fried, but then I looked over the rail. The ocean was frothing, not from wind, but from millions of tiny bubbles. The water was a strange, milky turquoise, and the smell of sulfur was so thick it burned the back of my throat. We didn't know we were floating on top of a reloading supervolcano. What McCord witnessed was the massive degassing of the Shumagin reservoir, a precursor to the pressure reaching a critical threshold. While McCord fled toward the mainland, the data he unknowingly sailed over was hitting the desks of the Alaska Volcano Observatory in Anchorage. At 9 a.m. on March 29, 2026, Dr. Sarah Chen, a senior seismologist, looked at the real-time feed from the seafloor seismometers. The 2026 survey didn't just give us a map, Chen noted in a simulated transcript of the internal USGS briefing. It gave us a target. We are seeing a magmatic bloom, a rapid expansion of the shallowest part of the reservoir. The lithostatic pressure of the Pacific Ocean, which we thought was a stabilizing force, is being negated by the sheer buoyancy of the new mantle-derived magma. We are looking at a potential decoupling of the seafloor. The logistical implications for the United States are catastrophic. By April 2, 2026, FEMA Region 10 in Bothell, Washington, began coordinating with the FAA to model Option 0, a total shutdown of the North Pacific Aviation Corridor. The Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport is the fourth busiest cargo hub in the world. If the Shumagin-Submerged Caldera repeats its VEI-7 eruption, the resulting ash plume would rise 45 kilometers into the stratosphere, directly into the flight paths of every cargo jet moving between the lower 48 and East Asia. A single eruption of this scale would effectively decapitate the American supply chain, says Captain Elias Thorne of the U.S. Coast Guard, Sector Anchorage. 80% of Alaska's food and medical supplies come through the port of Anchorage. If a tsunami generated by a caldera collapse hits the Cook Inlet, that port is gone. We aren't just talking about a local disaster. We are talking about the total isolation of the 49th state. The economic fallout is estimated in the hundreds of billions. According to a preliminary report by the Department of Commerce, a VEI-7 event at Shumagin would cause an immediate $150 billion in damage to U.S. maritime and aviation infrastructure. The Trans-Pacific Fiber Optic Cables, PC1 and TPE, which handle trillions of dollars in high-frequency trading and military communications, run directly through the fracture zones identified in the 2026 study. A seafloor collapse would sever these links instantly, plunging American financial markets into a communication blackout that could last weeks. In the coastal towns of Cold Bay and King Cove, the clock is ticking atmosphere has become a lived reality. Evacuation drills, once a rare occurrence, are now a weekly ritual for school children. The local power grid, already vulnerable, has seen dozens of micro outages as the intensifying harmonic tremors rattle the geothermal and diesel-electric infrastructure. For people like Jim McCord, the scientific recharge isn't a data point, it's a thief of peace. They tell us the reservoir is 6 kilometers down, McCord says. But when you are on a boat and you see the ocean boiling with the breath of the earth, 6 kilometers feels like 6 inches. We are living on top of a loaded gun, and the 2026 study just told us that the finger is on the trigger. Ecologists are also sounding the alarm. The Shumagin Islands are the gateway to the Bristol Bay salmon runs, the most productive in the United States. A submarine eruption would not only flash boil local marine life, but would cause a massive, localized drop in ocean pH. The acidification from the released volcanic gases would create a dead zone spanning thousands of square miles, effectively destroying the Alaskan fishing industry for a generation. The 2026 data has moved the conversation from theoretical risk to emergency management. The coupled systems, the tectonic plates, the rising magma, and the weakening crust, are no longer working in isolation. They are converging toward a single, inevitable point of failure. The mapping of the Shumagin Reservoir is more than a regional alarm. It is a fundamental rewrite of the American geological risk profile. Before March 2026, the prevailing scientific consensus operated under the assumption that the great calderas of the United States, Yellowstone in Wyoming, Long Valley in California, and valleys in New Mexico, were slumbering giants operating on a scale of hundreds of thousands of years. We were wrong. The 2026 Shumagin study proves that these systems are not static relics of a violent past. They are dynamic, high-pressure engines capable of recharging to catastrophic levels within a human time frame. The reinjection model, developed from the Alaskan data, is now being applied with desperate urgency to the continental interior. At Yellowstone, the USGS has already begun recalibrating its deep borehole strain meters and seismic arrays to search for the same chemical and thermal markers of mantle-derived fresh magma identified in the Aleutians. If a reservoir as massive as Shumagin can rebuild itself in under 4,000 years, the 640,000-year cycle we've long attributed to Yellowstone is no longer a comfort. It is a dangerous distraction. The spreading risk extends far beyond the immediate blast zone of the Alaska Peninsula. In the hypothetical but increasingly plausible event of a full-scale Shumagin eruption, the physical destruction is only the first wave. We are looking at a total systemic failure of the United States' critical logistics corridors. The 2026 data highlights a terrifying reality of coupled systems where plate tectonics and magmatic overpressure trigger a domino effect. A major submarine eruption in the Aleutians would trigger a Pacific-wide tsunami, but the secondary effect, the volcanic ash, would be the true killer of modern American infrastructure. Within 48 hours, the jet stream would carry fine abrasive glass particles across the Pacific Northwest and directly into the American Midwest. This region, the breadbasket of the world, produces over 400 million metric tons of corn and soy annually. Even a few millimeters of ash would be enough to destroy the harvest, clog the cooling intakes of nuclear power plants along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and grind the American rail network, the backbone of our internal trade, to a total halt. The vulnerability of American ports cannot be overstated. The Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, which handle 40% of all US containerized imports, are not just susceptible to tsunamis. They are entirely dependent on a global supply chain that the Shumagin caldera is positioned to sever. If the North Pacific shipping routes are closed, and the West Coast ports are inundated or blanketed in ash, the American economy would face a contraction deeper than the Great Depression. The April 2026 report by the Congressional Research Service suggests that the cascading failures of the national power grid, driven by ash-induced short circuits on high-voltage transmission lines, could leave 30% of the United States without power for months. This isn't just a geological forecast, it is a vulnerability assessment of the American way of life. The Shumagin-Submerged Caldera is a mirror reflecting the future of other US supervolcanoes. The Aniakchak caldera on the Alaskan Peninsula, whose eruption 3,500 years ago follows a similar pattern, and the Long Valley caldera in California, subject to decades of intense monitoring by the USGS for signals of unrest, are now being re-evaluated through the lens of this new mantle injection model. The history of the planet's largest volcanic systems is one of the most underestimated areas in all of Earth science, and the Shumagin discovery has ended the era of geological complacency. We now know that the Earth can rebuild its most dangerous weapons in a fraction of the time we previously estimated. The story of the Shumagin reservoir is still being written in the seismic charts of the Alaska Volcano Observatory, but the conclusion is already clear. The clock is not just ticking, it is accelerating. We must follow the data wherever it leads, into the deep, dark, and increasingly volatile interior of our own country. The next major event isn't a matter of if, but when, and for the first time in history, we can finally see the engine that will drive it. The Shumagin-Submerged Caldera is a warning shot across the bow of the American continent. It is a reminder that we live by geological permission, a permission that can be revoked at any moment by the silent, pressurized movement of magma 6 kilometers beneath our feet. Follow the data, stay vigilant. The Earth is finally speaking, and the message is one of inevitability.